Hello, and welcome to Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent. I'm your host, Dakota Palicki, and it's a pleasure to be with you on this Veterans Day. As we celebrate and honor the millions of active duty service members and veterans, we are taking a moment to reflect on how our nation has and has not supported these Americans during their transition out of military and into education. Before we get started, I should note that Lumina Foundation is a 501c3 nonpartisan private foundation focused on improving learning after high school. Federal law requires that we avoid expressing views on specific legislation, actions that could or should be taken in upcoming elections, or on specific candidates. The views expressed today by our guests are entirely their own and do not reflect the views of the foundation. But today, we're really excited about the lineup that we have. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Eddie R. Cole, a historian and scholar from UCLA, about some of the successes and challenges with the GI Bill, both past and present. We're also going to hear from Carrie Wofford, president of Veterans Education Success, about what lessons we should apply to future support. But first, let's start with two veterans who use their benefits to earn higher education. The Cyrus family has a long history with the military, and I had some time to catch up with the father and son duo, Joey and Joe Cyrus. Let's listen in. We're joined now by a father and son duo, Joe and Joey Cyrus, both who have served in the U.S. military and then used benefits to receive their education. Thank you both for joining.
Well, thank you, Dakota. I actually went into the military from Chicago back in 1977, and I spent almost 21 years in the military from 77 to 97. And during that time, I was at numerous bases, married my wife at Fort Lewis in 1980. And for the betterment of staying out of trouble, been married to her now for 40 years. She's a military veteran as well. So we went all over the world. We went to Germany. We were at Fort Lewis, Fort Hood, Fort Benning, just to name a few, and had a wonderful time serving in the military. And if had the opportunity to do it again, would do it all over again.
And so, Joey, I got to imagine, both mom and dad are in the military. That familial pressure to go in, what must have been quite a bit.
There was never really any pressure to join in, to follow in the footsteps. It was more of the economy. I just got out of doing my undergrad, got my bachelor's degree, and it was just tough to find a job. And it was definitely nice to have my dad as someone to go talk to about joining, since he had did 20 plus years, and kind of guided me to which branch I should join and stuff. So I ended up joining in 2009 and served almost 7 years and then separated. So yeah.
Yeah, Joey, what branch were you in?
I was in the Air Force.
Okay. And so I think it's interesting because a lot of the folks that we've talked to before on the show, they have entered the military first and then leveraged the military to go into education. But you kind of said, hey, listen, I already have this degree, the economy was where it was, and moved into the Air Force. Did you, in the Air Force, did you get a job occupation that was similar to what your bachelor's degree is in, or did you have to get a bunch of new skills and training to fulfill your military duties?
Yeah, my job in the military was nothing to do with my bachelor's degree, which was in business administration. Once I got into the Air Force, I started doing IT stuff. So, and that's what I used my GI Bill to get my master's, which is in cybersecurity. So I started that when I was active duty and then wrapped it up after I got out. And that's when I was using the post 9/11 and all that stuff. And I did some certifications as well through the post 9/11. They have the certification reimbursement program. So yeah, it was completely different career field than what I went to school for before I joined.
Were you excited by that, or was that kind of something daunting? Hey, welcome, here's your new job.
Yeah, I was excited to learn something new. It was a career field that had just been created right as I joined. So I was like one of the very first people to go into this career field, which was called cyber transport systems. It's a fancy name for basically just like networking and telephony stuff. So yeah, it was cool. It was fun.
If it's okay with you, Dakota, I want to take a moment and brag on my son.
Yeah, please do.
He scored so high on his ASVAB tests that was why they approached him about this new military category that was coming into play, and asked him if he wanted to be a part of it, and he said yeah. So I was very proud of him, because you can only score so high on the ASVAB test when you first go in. And he pretty much scored as high as you can score. So the table was open for him. He could pretty much choose any job he wanted to in the Air Force. So that was a check in the win column right there for him. But for me, after I retired, I'm a disabled vet. So I was approached by Vocational Rehabilitation Part Chapter 31 to go to school. I'm a first generational graduate, 4-year degree from Central Washington University in safety and health management. My son graduated from Central Washington. My daughter graduated from Central Washington. Michelle graduated from Central Washington. So we're a family of Central Washington University alumni in Ellensburg, Washington. And I used that graduation degree in safety and health to work for a company by the name of Georgia Pacific after I graduated, who hired me actually 6 months before I graduated. So the program works, and most people who enter it have jobs even before they graduate.
That's really impressive on both ends. And I got to say too, I mean, obviously this is a family affair in a lot of ways. I was joking with Joey before we all got on here that having worked with your wife just a little bit that I have, I know I generally do whatever the heck she tells me to do. So I have a feeling I'd do the same thing for any one member of the Cyrus family. One of the things that we talk about though, and Joe, I'd love to just stick with you on this because I wonder if Joey's going to have a different experience, is for a lot of folks that I've had a chance to talk to, the kind of training and experience they have in the military oftentimes doesn't get recognized when they go into higher ed. And they either have to repeat things that they have already done and can show and demonstrate mastery, or they get kind of cajoled in a pathway that they're not particularly interested in. And Joe, just to stick with you, did you have that kind of experience there as you migrated from, into higher education? Did you feel like, yeah, you know what, if I could have finished this in less than 4 years if only the institution would have been able to recognize some of my military service?
I did apply for some military acknowledgement, but it got turned down. But in my experience, my leadership for 20 years and retiring as a master sergeant, being a drill sergeant, being airborne, being a tank commander, being a platoon sergeant, being a first sergeant, being a acting sergeant major, being a master fitness expert, all of this translated into civilian type abilities that I could just take with me into college. And while I was in college, I was able to transpose all those abilities and characteristics into helping me complete my degree in 4 years. I started in June of 2010 and graduated in September of 2014. I was ready to get out of there and wanted to do it as quickly as I possibly could and as appropriately as I possibly could.
Yeah, Joey, I have to imagine that. I guess I'm curious, Joey, whether your experience was similar or not. Did as someone who went in and clearly specialized in a kind of specialist field of IT, when you went and got your master's using some post 9/11 bill benefits, Did more of that learning translate that helped you get that master's more quickly, or did you also feel like many veterans do, where you had to repeat a lot of learning?
I had to start from scratch basically on my master's. So it was a lot of the stuff that we initially, in the first couple classes I had already been familiar with, like the IT terminology and some of the processes and protocols and procedures. But I started from scratch, just like anybody else starting, a graduate program. And I took a little bit longer to do mine. I started my first master's class in, just because I was like full-time active duty, full-time dad, and trying to, do school. So I would just take one class at a time, and they're 6 credit classes. So they're a lot of stuff to do. I started in fall of 2013 and did like 2 or 3 back-to-back classes, and then took a couple years off, because I PCS'd from Andrews Air Force Base out here to Las Vegas for a new assignment. And then I finally picked it back up in, I think, spring of 2017, and graduated by spring of 2018, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. So it was and by that time when I restarted, I had already separated. I separated in 2016. So when I restarted back up, I wasn't doing the top up program. The top up program is something you do like when you're still on active duty. The military actually will pay for your school, and then whatever's not covered through the military, the GI Bill kicks in and covers the rest of the balance. So that's why it's the top up. And so I separated and restarted going, got BAH while I was going to school, working full time, still doing a dad. So I was still doing one class at a time, wrapped it up and in 2018. But back to your initial question, some stuff did translate, but I had to start from the beginning like everybody else,
Yeah, the top up bit is interesting too, because I guess one of the things and Joey, will stick with you here. I was curious about whether or not the post 9/11 GI Bill supports went far enough. We know college costs, for example, have been increasing, and then not to mention, like you said, you're trying to work, you're trying to be a father. There's a lot of other things that go into being a student. So, do you feel like you received enough support from the post 9/11 GI Bill?
Oh yeah, definitely. It was an easy process to start school when I was active duty, and it was easy to continue once I had separated. It was all about just, communicating and making sure you have like a good person on the other end that, knows what they're doing, knows what paperwork needs to be filed. And yeah, it was a super easy process. I didn't have any hurdles really at all.
That's really great. I mean, and clearly it sounds like, what I hear you saying is that, yeah, it really is helpful, especially when there's someone there to help you guide, make sure that everything's getting done correctly, all the forms are quite filled out, correctly and all that. Joe, kind of same question to you, knowing that you use Chapter 31 vocational rehabilitation. Do you feel like that was, supported well enough and that you're able to make ends meet while pursuing your 4-year degree?
Absolutely. With the vocational rehabilitation program, they paid for all 4 years of college. They paid for my parking. They paid for my books. They gave me a monthly stipend. I worked as a college student for different jobs. I did OJT around the college. So I had enough coming in to help support me. Plus I had my military retirement as well. I'm in a different category than maybe some other veterans where I have my military retirement on top of what the Chapter 13 Vocational Rehabilitation Program was affording me the opportunity to do. But bar none, they they went above and beyond the call of duty to get me through 4 years of college. I didn't have to come out of any out-of-pocket expense whatsoever.
Mm. That's really great to hear. You know, the other thing I kind of want to close on here, maybe, we know that obviously, you know, military service is a family undertaking, even if not everyone is active duty in the military. It is certainly an entire family event, an entire family kind of calling and affair. But so you know, and in some other ways too, being a student, a full-time student, whether you're going for that bachelor's or master's degree or whatever it might be, can also be a full family. And, you know, we started this by, you know, Joey kind of sharing that, you know, he was able to come to you, Joe. He was able to come to his dad to say, hey, what, you know, give me some advice. What do you think about joining up? So Joe, I'm curious, what advice did you give to Joey as he was transitioning out of the Air Force, pursuing a master's degree, while also, you know, being a full-time father? As someone who has walked in his shoes, what was the advice that you gave him?
I actually didn't have to give him any advice. He already had his own plan. He knew what he wanted to do once he got out of the military, because the Air Force is much different than the Army. In the Army, you don't have too many jobs in there that you can fall back on once you get out of. And I told him going in that if I had to do all over again, I probably would do the Air Force, because they give you so many opportunities that once you decide to get out, you can fall back on those jobs. I mean, a pilot, a helicopter mechanic, IT, doctors, and there's a lot of great jobs in the Army as well. But when you go in and you don't score as high as your son does on the ASVAB test, you only have certain jobs to choose from. So they made me a paratrooper to jump out of airplanes and hit the ground running and supply the troops in the field from the air. So what kind of job can you get out of that once you decide to go back into civilian life, other than the leadership aspect? So to answer your question, Dakota, he already had his plan, and I just supported him in whatever he wanted to do and told him that the sky's the limit. You can do whatever you put your mind to.
Mm. And so, Joey, you know, final word to you. Clearly, you've won the Son of the Year or Century Award here. What other advice, Joey, might you offer to someone who is in your same position, who is, you know, or was in your same position, I should say, leaving the military, trying to use their benefits, but also wrangling the duties of everyday life?
Advice I would give is, man, just utilize the benefits. You know, a lot of people, you know, for some reason don't go back to school or get certifications. And we did that time and, you know, paid our debt and paid into the program when you first come into active duty, you know, so we earned these benefits, and a lot of people don't utilize them, unfortunately. And I wish more people would. So every time I talk to a separating, or I find out someone's separating, I'm like, hey man, if you have any questions about the GI Bill or going back to school, and, you know, hit me up. I can answer pretty much anything. I did the certification reimbursements. I've done, you know, going back for a master's and everything. So I would just, my advice would be to just utilize your benefits and don't bite off more than you can chew. Like when it comes to trying to get it done quickly, and they end up taking like 4 classes while trying to work full time and juggle having a family as well, you know, just you have all the time in the world to complete it. So you don't need to take 4 classes at once. You know, you can take 2 or 3 and still qualify for all the benefits, the book stipend, the BAH, everything. So that's what I would tell someone.
I think that's really great advice. Joey Cyrus, first, on behalf of everyone at Lumina, thank you so much for your service. And thanks for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. I'm really grateful to know you. I'm really grateful to work with your wife/mother. She's doing some really great work up in Detroit, and it's a real pleasure to work with her. So big thanks to Michelle for connecting us as well. Again, thanks so much for spending some time with us today.
You're welcome, Dakota. And pretty soon we'll be calling her Dr. Cyrus.
I can't wait for that. That's great news. That's great news.
All right.
Thanks for having us, Dakota. Appreciate it.
Oh, our pleasure. You have a good day now.
Thank you. All right, any questions out there that need answers, just give them my email and or my LinkedIn or something, and I'll connect with them and help them get through the process or whatever. So I'm available.
Absolutely. Will do. All right.
Thank you, Dakota.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll see you soon.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. My thanks again to Joe and Joey Cyrus for joining us today, and to Michelle for connecting us. It's always a great pleasure to connect with the Cyrus family. And I'm very glad to hear that they had the support they needed to be successful as they transitioned out of the military and into education. But regrettably, we know that that transition hasn't worked for everybody, and that not everyone has been able to access the full support the GI benefit promises. So to get a better historical perspective, we're bringing in higher ed historian and associate professor of UCLA, Dr. Eddie R. Cole, to join us. Dr. Cole, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Cole, I want to jump straight into learning a little bit more about you. I know that we've met through our mutual colleague, Catherine Weedle, Dr. Catherine Weedle. But tell us a little bit about yourself and your area of interest for your study.
Yeah, I'm a historian of higher education. Specifically, I focus on the college presidency and social movements. So understanding the role that college presidents have played in shaping racial policies and practices throughout the mid-20th century. So if we think about the Black freedom movement, really the peak years from the 1940s through the 1960s, I look at academic leaders and their quiet yet influential role in shaping those policies. And many of those policies include things that we think about, obviously, such as segregation versus desegregation, but also some things that we don't often think about. Is the role of college presidents in shaping housing policies at the federal level, as well as free speech and the original affirmative action programs within higher education.
Well, it sounds like you're exactly the person we want to talk to today then, because we're really diving in. I want to kind of dive a little bit into the original GI Bill. We know one of the things that, the GI Bill didn't explicitly include Black veterans in its language, but the way it was implemented, many of the challenges, the context it was in, ended up ultimately at some, at one prediction, shut out 1.2 million Black veterans from receiving full benefits. And so I was hoping you could just start by educating us and our audience a little bit more about why was that the case? What happened with the GI Bill to relate to create those inequitable outcomes?
Yeah, it was lack of federal enforcement of the actual principles behind the GI Bill. So imagine two areas in particular: housing, which I just mentioned, but also education. So what happens is you get a federal policy such as the GI Bill, and then it has to be implemented on the local and state level, right? So one instance being on housing, which we know quite a bit about, is that the GI Bill offered veterans an opportunity to have access to home loans, purchase a home, really establish a family, and move themselves into middle class, the American dream, if you will. When it came down to banks on the local level, as well as racial restrictive covenants, which were prominent through the 1930s into the 1940s, all of these things added up in a way that when it came time for a Black veteran to try to purchase a home, a Black veteran to move into certain neighborhoods, the usual obstacles within the overall housing discrimination in America was in place. It just didn't matter whether you were in the US South or the Northeast or the Midwest or out on the West Coast. This was a national phenomenon unfolding. And the same instances are in place when it came to education. The GI Bill also provided numerous educational opportunities for veterans, yet as we know about higher education through the 1940s into the 1950s and so forth, is largely segregated. Even at institutions that aren't formally segregated, there's still this consideration of race and not admitting a significant number of Black students, particularly Black veterans. And so you see the influx of Black veterans getting access to higher education, largely at Black colleges throughout the U.S. South, with a few outside of the South.
Yeah, I think that's it's really interesting, and you know, we're going to certainly get into the intersectionality of some of the policies that you know, that reinforce some of the structural racism we have. But you know, I think you're tapping on something that I know in my preparation I've had a lot of conversations about, which is a lot of folks still have this assumption that if there were challenges to the GI Bill, so there's a general acceptance that first there's this thought that there might not be any issues. Second is that if there were challenges, it was only in the South. But historian Ira Katz-Nelson even writes that in the New York and New Jersey suburbs, fewer than 100 of the 67,000 mortgages insured by the GI Bill were supported home purchases by people of color. And so clearly it was a widespread issue. I do want to get to the where you just left off, though, which was in addition to some of the redlining and historic housing discrimination issues we saw at the time, there was still this campus practice. University programs weren't letting in, you know, people of color. There was a disproportionate dishonorable discharge. What, you know, can you dive in a little bit more and just talk about some of the ways that campus leadership and individual campus decisions during that time further kept people out from using these full benefits?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's important to understand that when you want to understand U.S. history, it's important to understand U.S. higher education history, because those things are intertwined. Colleges and universities are not immune from shaping much of American society. And so one thing that's notable is that when we get into the 1950s, and this is important, this is on the heels of the GI Bill, we get into the 1950s, you see this influx with the Great Migration of Black citizens leaving the U.S. South, moving to the Northeast, Midwest, and out to the West Coast. In these particular areas, you see these Black neighborhoods getting closer and closer to college campuses. Here's where it's notable in the sense that numerous college presidents and chancellors actually don't want to be that close to Black neighborhoods, even though they tout themselves as being more liberal and progressive in thinking because they're not formally segregated like universities in the South. And so you see such a chancellor such as Lawrence Kipling at the University of Chicago has a meeting in the 1950s with the president of Harvard, MIT, Columbia University, University of Pennsylvania, and Yale. These 6 men come together and start to lobby on the federal level around housing funds that eventually goes toward urban renewal. And you see how universities take millions of federal dollars and start to dramatically displace Black households in American cities. And what that does is shows that even these universities that have advertised themselves as welcoming Black students, having some Black faculty at a time when it's unheard of at numerous universities in the US South, this becomes notable in the sense that you see how university leaders actively shape housing policies that have a direct impact on housing in America. So by the time we get to the early 1960s, we see that Black citizens in the United States, particularly in Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, are paying millions and millions of dollars more in rent and housing than their white citizens are. And so that's so notable that that's largely influenced by these major universities trying to protect their neighborhoods and protect their campuses that stay a majority white. Because at the time, the University of Chicago only has 1% to 2% of its student body being Black students. So it's largely segregated even without using the term segregation.
And I just want to keep going on the urban renewal side of this, which is clearly campus presidents, as you just outlined, and others had tremendous influence over housing policy. Yes. That kept people from utilizing education benefits. There were historical standards of exclusion and practice of exclusion that kept people out of receiving the kind of education and tapping into education benefits that the GI Bill entitled them to. I'm also mindful, though, of those who did successfully get some kind of additional education, use their GI Bill, but were locked out of participating in the labor force. And you mentioned kind of the urban renewal side, which is that because of the discriminatory housing practices, many people of color, from my understanding, were concentrated into urban areas, left out of the growing suburbs where many of the jobs and economic development was also happening. Can you talk a little bit about the tension between the jobs that we were retraining service members for and then their inability to access the labor market for which we provided federal funding for them to be trained in that labor market?
Yeah, no, that's spot on. And you're right to say that only a few Black veterans being able to access this training, because it wasn't just access to formal higher education, a 4-year degree, for instance. It was also training in these very technical fields that would allow you to work in the factories. And so these jobs were also discriminatory in their housing practices, right? You can imagine post-World War II, the aircraft and shipping industries are booming. That really drives a lot of the migration, Black migration to the West, because there's so many factory positions. But even when it came time to, if you were lucky enough to secure training using your GI benefits, you were not oftentimes guaranteed a job in these same factories. And that becomes widespread to where we see this American dream and the suburban sprawl is bubbling up across the United States. Yet at the same time, largely housing segregation and employment and education become intertwined. So it's one of these things that I always like to say, that when we think about the GI Bill and we think about housing, you have to keep the conversation going from where you live determines your access to education. Your education determines your job opportunities, and your job opportunities ultimately determines your income, which puts you right back to where you can live. And that becomes one just cycle for how you can have federal policy on paper that doesn't exclude a particular race, but at the same time, when it comes down to implementation, it's still there. The racism is still embedded within it, and the discrimination exists. So again, great question. Just another example of how the GI Bill came up short in reality.
So we've been talking a lot about, the original Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, but we know the GI Bill today is a moniker used to describe all sorts of, aid packages that are directed towards active duty service members and veterans. So from your perspective as a historian, how have some of the issues that existed within the first GI Bill, and certainly the impacts as a result of the implementation of the first GI Bill, carried into modern times?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I got a segment in my book that talks about this disparity in just income and being able to build up net worth per household. And you can obviously understand that it has generational impact as well. But, one thing I would say when we think about contemporary terms around these sort of pieces of legislation, it's important that current lawmakers, people currently involved in shaping policy, understand history. And that is so critical. My own bias as a historian, obviously, but it's so important to understand history because it tells us where we are today, and not just know the general facts of history, but understand the decision-making process, because that largely will tell us how the decisions we're making today are eerily similar at times to decisions made in the past. Because trust me, when putting it on paper in 1944, certainly there were people in the room who signed on to the original GI Bill and did not think of it as a racially exclusive act. It was an inclusive idea, but when it came down to implementation, it wasn't there. And so when we think about the contemporary context around the GI Bill and the actual benefits for current service individuals as well as veterans, it's important for us to remember that there are opportunities that we may be overlooking, and without full understanding of history, we're doomed to repeat some of those steps. Or worse said, we're doomed to continue those steps.
Absolutely. I think it's challenging too for some folks in the kind of the broader narrative perspective who might not know as deep the history or the data or information. We see so many people that are positively impacted by the supports they're offering now. But certainly, I certainly agree with you that we're seeing we at least run the risk of continuing to repeat ourselves. And so within that spirit, I guess I kind of want to close by asking you, as we're entering into a space of, American recovery, expecting more, aid packages to support people in getting the kind of education and training they need to succeed in tomorrow's economy. From your perspective as a historian, what advice can you offer policymakers or others to help us learn and not repeat the past?
Yeah. One thing that I've seen consistently throughout history, particularly studying university leaders and their relationships with federal lawmakers, is that oftentimes they make decisions about particular populations, but they don't make decisions with the input of particular populations. And that's something that any lawmaker today or academic leader or even corporate leader in conversation and relationship with laws being, policies being developed, it's critical to start seeing the individual citizen as an equal partner within the overall enterprise toward racial equity. And that's going to be essential to trying to have a real racial reckoning in 2020 and going forward, is that voices have to be at the table and these voices have to be weighed equally. Instead of making decisions about people, it's going to be absolutely essential to make these decisions with people.
I think that's really great advice. Do with, not to or for, right? I mean, that's exactly right. Well, Dr. Eddie Cole, thank you very much for joining us today. I know you have a new book coming out. Is it too early for us to talk about that, or do you want to give us a little teaser?
No, it's right over my shoulder right here.
There it is.
The book has come out within the last month. The Campus Color Line, College Presidents and the Struggle for Black Freedom. And ultimately, it's a national history of the college presidency and their role in shaping the Black freedom movement. And that, is one of those things that you can't, when you start writing a book, you can't imagine the world that it will come into. But just from a timeliness standpoint, the questions that we're asking today, the racial issues before us right now, are all grappled with within the book. And so it's one of those things where if we're having questions about housing right now or housing discrimination historically, but gentrification today, right? Those things I cover in the book. College access, who can and can't go to certain universities, things that I cover in my book from a historical perspective, as well as free speech today, right? But where does free speech end? Where does hate speech begin? Those are all issues that I grapple with in the book, particularly understanding the Black freedom movement as seen through the actions of college presidents. And so if anyone is even remotely interested in trying to get a better understanding of these high level policies that implement every inch of the United States, I would encourage you to grab the book.
Well, I'm looking forward to getting my copy and having you back on the show to talk more about that.
Absolutely. It would be my pleasure.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for joining us and have a great day.
Hey, thanks for having me. Bye.
Hey, everyone. Welcome back. We had some really great conversations so far, and I want to bring us now into modern day, into the future. We're very fortunate to be joined by Carrie Wofford, the president of Veterans Education Success, here to talk to us about her organization and some of the priorities for the future. Carrie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about what Veterans Education Success is.
Sure. So we are a policy advocacy organization in Washington. And we also provide free legal services to veterans, and those are closely connected. So we will often advocate before federal policymakers about the concerns that veterans are bringing to us in our free legal services. And we've been around getting close to a decade, and we were founded by former Senate Education Committee senior staff. I was one of those. And so we came out with some sort of expertise about higher education policy and the gaps and what needed to be fixed, and felt that veterans were being underrepresented. And so one thing, for example, that we brought was a sense that there weren't enough voices of current veteran students being brought into the halls of Congress and being heard by policymakers. And we feel that elevating student veteran voices is really important, so that policymakers, as they're making decisions about what a policy should look like, have a sense of the granularity of the impact on a student veteran and what they are experiencing getting into and through higher education. So that's been a big part of what we do, and it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, so on today's show, we've started with Joe and Joey Cyrus, both who leveraged modern versions of the GI Bill to get their education, and it worked really well with them. And then we've just heard from Dr. Eddie R. Cole about some of the historical challenges that not everyone has been able to necessarily leverage the full benefits. I guess bringing us into modern times, what do you hear from veterans in particular about some of the challenges they're facing as they transition and separate from the military and get into our education and work landscape?
Sure. There's a lot of issues and concerns they have that are more general, but maybe I'll start first with sort of the racial equity issues, because that's what you had just been speaking about with your prior guest. The student veteran population is more racially diverse than the general population because, of course, the enlisted armed services are more racially diverse than the general population, and they are much more likely to be a first generation going to college. So 62% are first generation. So when you see inequities that are racially based, then we think it's very important that federal policymakers pay attention to that and get to meet some of the students who are impacted. Another thing that is a broader concern probably, but has a concerning racial injustice element, is the degree to which veterans in particular and students of color in particular are targeted by predatory companies that run colleges which aren't the kinds of colleges that you've ever seen or heard of, but they're companies, they're corporations, and they are basically advertising operations that draw in unsuspecting, unexperienced students whose parents didn't go to college and aren't around to help guide them, and take their GI Bill or load them up with student loans. One thing, for example, this will help some of your audience members who don't follow sort of the nuances. Everybody has been hearing about student loan debt during the presidential campaign. So you've heard a lot of the presidential campaign candidates talking about student loan debt and what are we going to do about the student loan problem. And it will be very interesting to watch the new president come in, as he has talked a lot about student loan debt and the importance of taking action to alleviate student loan debt. And we'll have to see what he does and how far he goes. And we'll have to see also what Congress does. But if you dig deep into student loan debt numbers, sort of a shocking fact emerges. And that is that the worst student loan debt problems are clustered in these predatory companies. So for example, these companies get about 13% of students nationwide, but they account for more than 40% of student loan debt in the country. And they take about 1/3 of all GI Bill funds and about nearly half of all military student aid. So they're very focused on the military and veteran population because of a ridiculous loophole in federal law that is one of those sort of classic Washington errors that creates this loophole that leads to bad targeting. So anyway, they did. So, and it's something that we work on and we try and educate Congress about, and we bring veterans in to talk about Congress about. But the point is that this student loan, these crazy amounts of student loans and the default on student loans is really a problem that's clustered at a handful of companies. And so there will be discussion with the new president about to what extent the student loan debt of students who were cheated or tricked by one of these predatory companies should be automatically forgiven if there's enough government evidence of the fraud. So this is getting into the weeds, but there's a federal policy that talks about defrauded students. So if a student has been defrauded, cheated, tricked by a school, and the school loads them up with loans including loans they never authorized, then what should the government do? And so the current policy is the government should forgive those loans. Under the President Trump, none of those loans were forgiven, and the Betsy DeVos, the education secretary, was hauled into federal court on a number of occasions for refusing to grant the loan relief to students where there was government evidence of fraud. So the government, when the Justice Department is suing a school for fraud and has collected massive amounts of evidence of fraud, then it doesn't make sense for the other arm of the government, the Education Department, to say, well, we're not sure there is fraud, we're not going to forgive the loans of those students. And there's a racial equity element to this that's very concerning, because most of this is among students of color. So you do see students of color, first generation students, many of them veterans, targeted by these companies, and you do see them wind up with huge amounts of loans. I mean, like 100,000, 200,000, crazy amounts of loans for not even a real education. So, for example, this is interesting, but most colleges spend more educating the student than they charge in tuition. And some of them spend much more. So, for example, there's a John Jay Criminal Justice Public Community College in New York in the CUNY system. They spend nearly 300% of tuition on the education of the student. So they're charging, I'm making this up, but they're charging, let's say, $6,000 a year, sorry. But they're spending on the student $18,000. That is not atypical. So, most nonprofit and public universities are spending more on the education of the student than they're charging. Public universities, because of course they're subsidized by the state. Nonprofit universities, because it's their nonprofit mission to educate people, and they tap into their endowment, and they get grants and research grants, and they have all ways of subsidizing student tuition. In contrast, at some of these companies, for example, Colorado Technical University sounds like a real university, but it's not. And American Intercontinental University sounds like a real college, but it's not. They're both owned by a company called Prodocchio, used to be called Career Education Corporation. This is a company that 50 states sued for defrauding students. This is a school that the federal Trade Commission, which monitors deceptive advertising, sued for defrauding students. They had to pay $500 million in a settlement with all the states of the country. So that's actually it was 48 states, sorry, not 50 states, it was 48 states. 2 states, California and New York, held out because they thought they could get a better settlement. So they're still suing them. But so these are not nice people, right? This is not a company that's very nice. They spend less than 10% of tuition on the student. So that just gives you a sense of why their education might be really shoddy. And the really disturbing element is the racial targeting element and the targeting of veterans, first generation students. It's just, it's sad that they're unsuspecting. So that's a more particular element of the student loan larger question, but I think you will see it bubble up. So I think you will see the new president talking about students who were cheated and students who were defrauded. He did talk a little bit about it during the campaign trail. He talked about veterans. He talked about how they were targeted by these for-profit companies and we needed to do something about it. And I do think that you will see more action on forgiving the loan debt of these students who were targeted for racial reasons and targeted for their GI Bill in ugly ways, illegal ways.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And what I appreciate, what I hear you saying, so there is this, forgiveness, particularly of fraudulent behavior element to this. I also really appreciate that, one of the solutions, that we haven't talked about, because I think it is just, yes, it's important to provide, but is not impactful, is just the solution of saying, hey, if these people had better information, if these veterans had better information, they wouldn't make these choices. And while that's certainly, awareness is certainly part of it, I appreciate that we haven't gone straight to that and saying that that'll fix the issues. I guess I am curious though, you've mentioned some of the loophole issues that are existing. I guess as a layman not into the nuance of all this, I'm wondering, why are some of these institutions, when we have 50 states suing an institution, at what point do we decide as a society that, they are not eligible for GI Bill to receive, those benefits, to receive federal dollars that are supposed to be meant for these kind of education benefits? So is there like an eligibility issue here? Is that part of the loophole you're describing?
You're totally spot on, Dakota. That was a big heated issue. Once the state settled for $500 million with this company, and once the Federal Trade Commission had also sued and settled with this company, veterans organizations like us approached the Department of Veterans Affairs and said, why on earth are you approving these schools owned by this company for GI Bill? The evidence is nationwide and universally accepted. This is not a political issue. Every GOP state sued, every Democratic state sued, every state sued. The career civil servants at the Department of Veterans Affairs read the lawsuits, studied the evidence, requested the evidence from the Federal Trade Commission, and did conclude that the fraud was concerning enough that they should not be allowed to receive GI Bill. Then the company lobbied the Trump White House, and the Trump White House stepped in and overrode the civil servants' decision and announced that the schools were great and there was no problem. But don't forget that President Trump was also the president of Trump University before it was shut down by the state of New York for defrauding students prior to his becoming president of the United States. So he certainly had his own personal history in defrauding students, and one can imagine that his top staff might have not been interested in seeing any harm done to other fraudulent corporations that were ripping off students. So we would anticipate a very different oversight by the Biden administration. We would anticipate they would not interfere with career civil servants doing their job, implementing the law, protecting students, protecting the GI Bill. And we would hope that the Biden administration would pay special attention to this. So we would hope that they would be concerned that veterans are being targeted. As you mentioned, the sort of advertising and the getting information to students. One of the main problems right now is that many of these predatory companies are on military bases recruiting students right now, and they're not supposed to be. And I would hope that a new administration would enforce those laws and get them off the bases. And many of these companies have cozy relationships with the base education officers. That's something that also needs to be better policed, because you just want service members and veterans to be given fair and accurate information so that they can make a good decision about the schools that might serve them well versus schools that might take advantage of them. So we're very hopeful about what happens under a President Biden, and we're anticipating better protection for the GI Bill. But you are absolutely right to ask the question, how on earth is the VA sending GI Bill money to schools that have been sued by every state in the country and sued by another arm of the federal government? It's exactly the right question to ask.
Mm. So, as we are looking towards 2021, a new administration, obviously some movement in Congress, we've had a chance to hear from you about some of the student debt issues and certainly some of the predatory kind of providers that are out there and eligibility for GI Bill funding. What else is where do you think we need to be focused as we walk into the next administration, the next Congress, to best support veterans?
Sure. You'll see immediately, possibly even this month and next month, even before Biden takes office, you will see Congress trying to hammer out a deal on COVID relief. And students are part of COVID relief. So when COVID first hit, student emergency grants to students were approved by Congress. The Education Department under Betsy DeVos did not distribute those in ways that we felt were fair. That many people raised concerns about the fairness and how those funds were distributed. In particular, they made a decision that iced out veterans. So they said that the only students who could receive an emergency grant were students who had filled out a FAFSA financial aid form. And of course, there are students who, because of the GI Bill, don't need to fill out a FAFSA and don't need to take on loans. And so many GI Bill students at nonprofit and public universities don't have any student loans because they don't need them. They tend to be loaded up with student loans at these for-profit colleges unfairly and without need, and sometimes without their knowledge or permission, which is illegal, but is also rampant. But a student veteran at a nonprofit or public university who didn't fill out FAFSA and is on the GI Bill might still have the same need as another non-veteran student for emergency grants. So some of those emergency grants were things like $1,000 to get home, right? So the campus is closed all of a sudden. All of a sudden, campuses across the country closed in the spring. Some students from low-income families were stranded. They couldn't get home, and they didn't have a computer. They'd been using the free computers in the school library. They didn't have a computer to be a student online from home. So the COVID relief package was supposed to take care of them. The way that Betsy DeVos implemented it did ice out student veterans. We believe that Congress, as one of its first orders of business, even before inauguration, possibly before inauguration, will take up another COVID relief package. Certainly from the newspaper, you and I know that the main focus will be state government relief, health, hospital equipment, and small business relief. But student relief will also be, we would assume, would also be in there. And we want to make sure that this time veterans aren't iced out. We've also had, scrambles. We had to scramble real quick when COVID first hit because the way that VA interprets its rules, it felt that a school that suddenly closed its campus and went online had not applied to be an online college and therefore should be cut off from GI Bill. So you had students from like Georgetown and Stanford and these, highly reputable universities where the VA was saying, we're going to cut them off because Stanford and Georgetown never asked permission to be an online school. And everybody, of course, threw their hands up and thought this was, sort of nitpicky ridiculousness. And notably, the Education Department did not do this. So the Education Department looked at its laws and said, we're not going to give any school a hard time. If you need to be online because it's not safe to have your campus open, if you need to close your dorms, we're not going to punish you for that. But VA felt that the rules required them to. There was certainly a lot of people who thought that was not true, but Congress had to move real fast to change the law to say, during a health crisis, if a school needs to go online, the VA shall, forgive the nitpicky rule that says they didn't apply to be an online school. So we had some of that rushing around. We think most of that is now fixed for the rest of COVID, but we'll have to be watching that. I'm looking at my notes off to the side, sorry. I think that another topic that I imagine you'll see Congress take up, which we hope would be soon. We don't know, and it is a topic that the incoming president has spoken about specifically on the campaign trail, is this loophole I mentioned, in which there's this crazy loophole that leads for-profit companies to target veterans for their GI Bill. It's a no-brainer to close that loophole, and there's a bipartisan bill to do so, and increasing congressional support to do so, partly because they've heard the students. So we brought students to Washington, and people and the lawmakers heard the students and heard their concerns and heard that being targeted because of the loophole didn't really seem fair. So we're hopeful that Congress would work to solve that. If they don't, we would hope that the new administration would step in and push that, just to fix it's one of those Washington silly things where you tell someone on the sidewalk about this loophole and they just think it's silly. So it's easy to fix, and we hope it will be.
Well, it sounds like you have a full agenda as you're moving forward, and a lot of work to do. Carrie Wofford, thank you so much for joining us today, and really appreciate your time and all that you're doing to support veterans.
Thank you so much. Nice to be with you.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. My thanks to our guests Joe and Joey Cyrus, Dr. Eddie R. Cole, and Carrie Wofford. Our show is produced by John Strauss, Jacob Mann, and me, Dakota Palicki, with support from Matthew Jenkins and the team at Site Strategics. Well Done Marketing supports the promotion of our show. Deborah Humphreys and Kevin Corcoran provide leadership for Lumina's strategic engagement efforts. A big special thanks to my close friend and colleague, Dr. Catherine Weedle, for helping us to connect to some guests today and produce our show. Be sure to subscribe and rate our show wherever you're getting your podcasts. If you have an idea or a comment for a new episode, reach us at luminafoundation.org or reach me on Twitter at Dakota Palicki. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time.